Good morning, everyone. I'm Becky Muir from Becky's Place, and this is the first class that we'll be having for the Great Australian Craft Show 3. This morning, we're going to be colouring this image here from the Girls' Night set of stamps, and it's this tumbler here full of drinks, full of something exciting, a nice cocktail or something cool and refreshing. What I'm going to show you today is basically a little bit about transparency, which is being able to see through an image that you colour. So in this case, what I'm going to show you is how we can make it so that it looks like this drink is a bit transparent and we can see the straws going all the way through. That just adds a bit of realism to our image, a bit of interest and a bit of depth. Okay, these are the colours that I've already chosen. So I'm using a mix of alcohol markers, which happen to be Copic brand, and I'm adding a little bit of coloured pencil over the top. I personally use Prismacolor pencils, but whatever you have in your supplies will be fine. So have a little look at that. That just gives you the codes with a bit of a swatch, so that you can see what I've used. You can choose your own colours, that's up to you. In the early lessons that I gave during the last craft show, we talked a little bit about limiting the amount of colours that you choose for your project. So as you can see, I've pretty much limited this one to 2 colours, which are these sort of aqua colours and the orangey red colours. It really is up to you, but I find personally that limiting your colour palette really helps make it a little bit more cohesive. Okay, so let's get started. Now I've stamped my image with water-based ink on a piece of blending card. You might remember, if you did any of the classes at the last show, that you want to mix 2 colouring families, two medium families. So a water-based ink will not react with the alcohol markers and the pencils that I'm using because they're from 2 different families. Now I'm just going to put this swatch underneath I might turn it over so it's not so distracting, because it tends to bleed through a little bit. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to start with the flower, and that's the one I'm going to colour using those oranges. I'll start with my lightest, which is an RO2, and I'm going to just stroke in the petals following the growth pattern of a flower, which is something else we discussed during the last craft show. Turn your work, makes it a little bit easier, allows you to get the tip of that marker right up to the edge of the image. Just pressing on that marker helps to flex the tip and will allow you to get a little bit more colour. Just go straight over the top of that stamen in the centre. Don't worry too much about that. We're going to add a lot more colour to that with pencil later on. And the pencil will sit on top of the surface, so it will sit on top of the marker, and you won't have to worry about what you've done underneath. Marker tends to be transparent anyway, so you can sort of see through it. Okay, so we're moving up to our next colour, which is an R12, and we're going to flick in some colour. Now I've added it to the centre, and I'm going to come from the outside edge backward. So what I'm trying to achieve here is, last time we talked about the push and pull of colour in the last classes. The darker the colour that you use, the more that area recedes. So I'm receding, I'm attempting to make the centre of the flower recede as if it's going down into where that stamen grows from. And I also want to curl the ends of this flower over just a little bit. So that's why I'm making them a little bit darker, so that this section here, that kind of area where I didn't add any of this R12, will be the highlight area, and that's what will come forward. So it'll appear sort of like the petal is bending a little bit, and you're having that nice little curve where it's coming forward. So the light area will come forward, look like it's closer to the viewer. Okay, so we'll just do that with all our petals. Again, not worrying about that stamen. There's not a lot of difference between this marker and the R02, but not having too big a jump will allow a nice smooth blend, so that we get a lovely end result. Okay, so moving into an R14, this one is a bit darker, or is a bit more red. There's a lot more pigment in it, as you can see. Again, we're concentrating that color into the center of the flower, and you can see those flicking strokes. As I come up on that flick, you can see it comes to a nice little point. Now we don't want to blend too much of that out, because that sort of gives a bit of movement into our image. I'm going to use this marker now to just here and there on the edges add a little bit more color, and that will help us shape some folds into the leaf of into the petal of our flower. Just give it a little bit more shape. All right, not too much, just here and there, anywhere that looks sort of like there might be a crease in the flower. Coming up to our R17. Now we're going to darken this a lot more with our pencil later on, but we're getting a nice foundation to work from here. So just a little. I'm not applying as much of the R17 as I did the last one. So each time you come up in color or deeper in color, you apply a little less, and that's what helps the blends. So now I'm going to come back down to my R14, and where I added that darker red, we're just going to blend a little bit. And then right back down to our R12. You can see the colors start now really to blend in with each other. Right around, getting all those petals. And then the last color is the R02. Now, you'll remember that we left this area here free of the darker markers. I'm not actually even going to take this lighter marker back over that area, because it will darken it by adding even just another layer of the same color. So if you want that to stay nice and light, you just leave all the rest of the marker off, which you can see is it's quite light in there. Not quite white, but almost. Okay, and that will be the lighter areas. And what we're doing is tricking our eye into thinking that this flower has shape. So we're trying to bring it up off the page by adding these lights and darks of color. All right, so moving on to the glass. Now I'm going to use the aquas. So this is going to be sort of a blue lagoon drink. And I'll start with my light, which is a BG01. And we'll just color in all that liquid. Now, when you're using or coloring a glass, leave some of the area around the edge of the glass. I've put in a little bit of line when I was designing the stamp, but when you're coloring a glass or jar, anything like that, leave just a little bit of space between the outside edge of the image and the liquid, and that sort of gives the impression that the liquid's contained within the glass, if that makes sense. Let me hold that up a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. There's a little bit of a white gap between where I've just colored with that blue and the edge there. So it's just a little bit of white. And you can add a bit of shine in there, a bit of darkness, a bit of dark grays or blacks to give the impression that it is glass. All right, now what I'm going to do is skip up to my darkest color, which is a BG07. I tend to be a colorer. I tend to stick to the lights a lot more than the darks. So what I usually do is add in my darks so that I'm just getting enough of them. Now, you have to be careful with that, because you can always come back and darken light areas, but once you've got your darks in, that's pretty much what you're stuck with, unless you work on them quite a bit, but then you run the risk of breaking up the pigment, and that's not ideal. Okay, so I'm adding in my darks. Now I'm giving that impression of roundness to my glass. That again is the push and pull of color. So the dark areas which I've just added will recede and the lighter areas will come forward. So I want this glass to look like it's rounded. So this area here will come forward. That's what I want to come forward, closer to the viewer, as though it were a glass, a rounded glass shape. Okay. Nice and smooth. Again, flexing the tip of those markers to a BGO2. All right. And then back to our BG01. We're going to add it right over the top of that, just to make sure it's nice and smooth. Now, if you wanted to keep working this, so right now it's quite flat. I've colored it quite smooth. If I kept working over the top of this while it was wet, so I just keep adding lots and lots of ink, what that will do is actually break up the pigment. So as I'm applying more and more alcohol marker, the alcohol will break up the color. And so it's not ideal when you're coloring. People generally say don't overwork the colors, but if you want it to look like an icy drink, if you keep just working those colors, eventually that pigment will start to break up a little bit and you'll get a bit of a fluffy look, which is great for little animals, or in this case, an icy drink. So if you wanted to keep working that, you can do that. Just be aware that it will bleed, so don't take it too close to the edge, or else you'll find that it starts to bleed quite a lot. All right, so now we have our lovely dark blue drink. I am going to bring in some neutrals. These are greys. These are the cool greys. So I've got a C6, a C7 and a C8, and I'm going to use those for my straw. I didn't want to introduce any extra colors. I only wanted to use the blue and the red orange, which is why I'm using a neutral for the straws. So I didn't want to introduce a third color, although usually having 3 colors in a design is fine. Well, having lots of colors is fine if you want to. I'm going to leave that gap. Let me just show you a bit closer here. Where the glass passes here in front of the straw, I'm not going to color through that. Okay. That just gives the impression that that glass continues on and that it's in front of the straw. You could come back later if you wanted to. If you do color through that, you can come back later with a white pen, or just leave it. It's not that big a deal, really. Just for those of us who are a little bit fussy. All right, so that's the C6. Oh, it's gone a bit blurry. Just take a minute to come back into focus. Sorry. And I'm going to darken up some colors. All right, so we've got our, there we go. Let me just switch that over. So we've got our base on, the base of the C6. And now we're going to darken up with the C7. Anywhere where it sort of falls behind something, we're going to add a bit of darkness. So where it comes back behind the flower, I'll just push it backwards by adding that darkness. So at the base of the drink, around here where the straw bends, and because you haven't got much room to work with, you need to be a little bit careful, but I'm just going to add it to the inside of the straw here and just along the bottom, just to give the idea that the straw is rounded. Now feel free, as I'm colouring along, I need to remember to check any comments, to ask me questions if you have any. Hi Brett, how are you? Feel free to leave a message over in the comments section, and I'll try to remember from time to time to have a look and make sure I answer any questions that you might have. Okay, so this is up to a C8. This is as dark as I'm going to go. And again, we're just darkening those areas for a little bit of a transition. So I want to push this part of the straw back here. And then again, we'll work that down back to the C7 for a blend. And into the C6. Now these classes will be available to watch throughout the entire month or throughout the entire subscription that you have. So you can come back and watch them at any time. All right, now we talked, or I mentioned briefly in the beginning and in the description, that I'm going to show you a little bit about translucency. So what I want to show you is to continue on with these straws so that they look like they're going inside this drink. I've got a C2, and all I'm going to do is add some of that directly over the top of the blue that I've colored. By following the direction of the image itself, I'm going to bring in just some color to give that idea. So I don't want a lot. I want to bring it through here. I don't want a lot down here. I want it to be a bit darker up this end, as though it's going through, and then the straw is sort of pushing away from me into the drink itself. So we're just going to add in a straightish line, as straight as you can do, and add in a little bit of grey ink, and just going to feather it away so it disappears. Same with that back straw. We're just going to feather in the idea that the straw there is going through the drink, and then feather it away so it sort of disappears underneath all of that drink. Maybe this back straw is leaning forward, so maybe we'll just add in the bottom of that one to give it some shape. There. And just by doing that, so by adding those couple of lines, it's just given the impression that the straws are going into the drink. It gives your image a little bit more interest and a little bit more depth. It just helps to make it a little bit more real. All right, so we've done the basics of our colouring with the markers. I'm going to move them off to the side, and we're going to bring in some pencils. I might just grab a black as well. So I've got a super dark red here. It's Tuscan red, PC 937, and it's nice and dark. And I'm going to use that down in around the bottom of the stamen and at the beginnings of the petals down here where they grow from. So I'm going to apply that quite dark so that this pushes that center of the flower down and gives the impression that it's shaped that way. As I come up the petal, I lighten the amount of pressure that I'm applying to the pencil until it feathers away to practically nothing. Okay, I'm going to just add a little bit, because most of this petal here is down inside the flower already. We don't want to add too much here because we don't want to push this petal back any further than it is. It's the part of the image that is probably closest to the viewer the whole way through. So we don't want to push that back too much, or else we'll have to push everything else back as well. All right, now this front petal crosses over these petals, so we can apply a little bit of darkness just under the edge of those on the back petals, on those petals behind, and that will push them back even further, and the contrast will bring this front petal forward even more. I'm going to apply a bit of darkness in that crease that I made, and then work my way around the flower. So I'm going to avoid the stamen now with the pencils at this point, because they will sit on top of that marker. And I don't want that right now. I don't want to darken that stamen anymore because it will disappear down inside my flower. So lots of pressure will release lots of pigment onto your page. So if you want it darker, Now don't press so hard that you end up with a shine on your picture, because that basically means you've burnished the surface of the paper and you won't be able to get any more color on there. Once you see that high shine, that's it. Your coloring's over. You won't be able to apply it any further on top. You'll be able to get a bit of a streaky look, but that's it. Nothing that's going to benefit your picture. So don't press so hard with the colors that you get that shiny finish unless you're ready to stop. If you're ready to stop, that's fine. So I'm just going to add a little bit more dark red here behind this fold of the flower, and again behind the edge of the petal. All right, now if I wanted to take that back even further, I can switch to a black. Be careful with how much of the black you use though, because it gets quite dark quite quickly. So just a little bit around the base of that stamen. And we don't want to cover up all the other pencil work that we just did. Now some colorists won't use black at all because they feel it's quite flat, but I quite like adding a little bit of black. I think it helps other colors pop a little bit more. Okay, so it's really very dark now around the base of that flower. It's hard to see with the light shining on it, but you can see I've made it quite dark down there amongst at the bottom of that stamen. Now I'm going to bring the stamen forward. Oh, that's the light shining on it a bit funny. Okay, so I'm going to bring the stamen forward by using this sort of light peach color. It's PC 939, and I'm going to just color my stamen. And I'm going to use a cream on whatever these little pollen things are. And that just lifts it again, lifts it off the background. And a little bit of yellow to that. This is not a hard design to color. You can see that we did it in just a few pens, with just a few pens and some pencils. And we got a nice look. It's not a hard image to color at all. So going down to our glass now, we have back into those grays. When you look at a glass, there's actually a lot of dark colors that reflect back off the glass. So we're going to just add in some streaks of gray. So that's a C6, and I'm going to add a little bit of C7. I'm going to leave a little bit of white area too. Right. If you wanted to bring in some white gel pen, you could do that. C6. And just following the shape of the glass. So it's that curved barrel of the glass to give it a little bit of color. And finally, we always ground our image. So just grab a C3, which is the same color family. We're using still the cool grays, and I'm going to just ground it here by adding a little bit of gray underneath in roughly the same shape as the glass itself. So it sort of looks like it's a bit of a cast shadow down here on the tabletop surface. Don't worry about making it too perfect. The flower would be sort of blooming here. So that was the C3, and I'm going to soften up the edges now with a C2. Right back over that C3. And then C1. The edges of your shadows are not crisp. They're quite broken up generally. Down to, this is a 0. So this is really going to break up those edges. So that breaks the pigment up entirely. You can see that happen. That'll happen as it dries. Now I'm actually coming back in with the C3 and I'm just going to darken right underneath. So right where it touches the surface of the tabletop or whatever it's resting on. Actually might need to go a little bit darker. So I'll grab the C4. Just darken that up a little bit more. And that just gives it something to sit on. That anchors it to the ground, gives it a place to exist in space. We talked a little bit about grounding during the last craft show. Just grounding your image to make it look like it belongs in its place in the world. Okay, it takes up physical space. All right, you could keep going. You could add more pencil work to the flower if you wanted to. So you might add in some, going back to that darker red, you might add in some extra veins by drawing little fine lines along the edge of the flower, along the petals. You can darken up the center. You could even add some highlights with a little bit of yellow if you wanted to. Yellow always looks nice on red. Don't go too heavy-handed though, because yellow isn't really a color that we've introduced anywhere else in the picture. So if you wanted to add a little bit of sunshine, we can do that. Do that in the highlight section. So that area that we left quite light, you can add a little bit of yellow in there, and that brightens the image and boosts those highlighted sections. Okay, and there we have it. One colored image ready for your scrapbook page or a nice card. And you can mix it up with some of the sentiments from the set. So there's a whole collection of sentiments in there. So why limit happy to an hour? So good for encouraging friends if you've got friends that are ready to get out of self-isolation, or there's birthdays coming up, that sort of thing. So there's heaps in there. Okay, thank you so much for watching. Now, if you have any questions, if you're watching this video a bit later on, that's fine. Just add some questions. I'll find them on Facebook a bit later on, and I'll be able to answer those questions for you. Or you can email me at becky@beckysplace.com, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Now, later on this afternoon, we've got a card making class. That's at 1 o'clock. And tomorrow at this time, for our next colouring lesson, we're going to be colouring these lilies. And what this class is about is colouring white. So when you've got a white teddy bear or a white flower or a white snowman, it's about colouring the image and how to create that illusion that they're white. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and I hope to see you at 1 o'clock for our card making class. See you then.